NVMe SSDs are the talk of the town thanks to its prominent inclusion in both next-generation consoles from Microsoft and Sony. And the adoption of an SSD, not to mention a still very expensive SSD, as the standard for game consoles is rightfully worrying for some of us who have large multi-terabyte hard drive arrays. Obviously, though, this is just what happens as technology evolves, and the same thing happened when hard drives started appearing, replacing the classic floppy disk. It's just the natural evolution of computer hardware, and thanks to our engineering being so precisely defined, we're now limited by the physical properties of the silicon atom, rather than limitations of the equipment used to print our CPUs. All that really means, though, is that we're coming to a point where we can't just rely on shrinking the transistors and components in our processors, because the gates are getting so small that electrons can just jump it without any voltage being applied. And when you've got millions, possibly even billions, of transistors controlling data buses and electrical flow, when electrons do jump this gate without provocation, it can mess up data buses, flip bits in memory, or even short something unintentionally. Especially if it's not just one or two transistors not performing correctly, and it's a more widespread issue. While we haven't reached that point where the phenomenon occurs frequently, with AMD hinting at 5nm parts coming later this year, we're really not that far off the threshold, which in the engineering community seems to be limited to just under 3nm. And what makes this kind of weird is that before, when we measured transistors in micrometers, we were still working at a large enough scale where we didn't have to worry about transistors literally being the size of an atom. And since we're now at the point where that's a legitimate concern, that means that we have to get creative with how we can improve and/or scale performance as time goes on. We first saw a solution to this with the introduction of multi-core processors in the early 2000s, which was a big step forward, because instead of designing the processor to be a single high-powered balls-to-the-wall CPU, we were able to parallelize workloads, which, in my opinion, is one of the most important fundamental concepts in modern computing. And since the introduction of the dual-core, we've seen quad-cores, hexacores, octa-cores, even duodeca-cores, and what this shows is the overall trend of hardware moving towards parallelizing tasks rather than doing them in a strict sequence on a single pipeline. It's a fascinating subject in my opinion, and it's amazing how similar observations can be applied to other components. Tying back into the beginning of this video, this same trend can be seen with secondary storage devices, starting off as magnetic tape, then moving to the floppy disk, and then finally adopting the hard disk drive as the general standard in the mid-2000s. And as time went on, this technology became significantly cheaper, to the point where I can buy a 2TB hard drive today for the price I paid for a 500GB hard drive about 10 years ago. Similarly, solid-state storage has come a long way since its initial introduction to the consumer space, starting off with the 2.5-inch SATA SSDs and moving to the PCIe-based NVMe standard starting around 2015. And the first consumer NVMe storage device was the Samsung 950 Pro, sporting 512 gigs of VNAND MLC for a cool $350. To put that into perspective, I only paid $100 for a drive with a similar capacity and generally improved and more consistent overall performance. I guess what I'm trying to say is that as time goes on and we figure out how to more efficiently manufacture this technology, prices will come down significantly, bringing NVMe to the mainstream market rather than keeping it priced for enthusiasts and mass-produced consoles. So for now at least, I wouldn't worry too much about whether or not your system is sporting an M.2 NVMe SSD, because even for at least the next 2 years, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One SKUs will still be mandatorily supported when developing for the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. It's going to be a cross-generational period, giving everyone time to make the necessary upgrades they want, and giving developers time to get used to this new hardware before they really start stretching its legs. To get an idea of what I mean, let's go over some tests I ran on 3 of my secondary storage devices. I picked them because it's a mix of solid-state NVMe, solid-state SATA, and hard disk SATA, giving us a look into how these individual drives compare to each other in the real world, rather than just theoretical gains brought on by upgrading the interface and storage medium. Looking at sequential performance, the NVMe SSD actually falls behind the SATA SSD, which is maxing out the SATA 3 interface and completely saturating it with both reads and writes. Meanwhile, the hard drive is still pulling functional numbers, and if you had this drive in your system, even as your boot drive, it would work perfectly fine. But this would happen. Over 5 fresh boots and averaging the times taken to fully log into my desktop, the hard drive is rocking a solid 313% increase to the time it takes from pushing the power button to seeing my desktop, as compared to a SATA SSD. But based on the graph I just showed you, the NVMe drive has less overall bandwidth to your RAM than the rough SATA equivalent. So how come its boot times are a solid second faster? Well, with SSDs there are 2 features of the performance profile that factor into whether or not one drive can quote-unquote outperform another one. The first one is sequential data transfer rates, and the second is shown by this graph, which is random reads and writes. Looking at these statistics from our test drives, you can see that the NVMe SSD has significantly less latency, which allows for it to squeeze in roughly 64% more IOPS than its SATA brethren. What this translates to is an overall faster communication link between your CPU and the files it needs to initialize when booting your system. Instead of having to request the files from a hard drive, wait for the drive to physically find the data, then relay it back, you instead have a direct electrical connection to where the data is stored. And when combined with NVMe, this allows for software to randomly pull files into and out of memory with less wait time, which wastes IOPS. The bus may not have the same amount of overall bandwidth, but you can think of it sort of like how voltage and current are related. If you have 2 power rails running in your system, which is commonly 12 volts and 5 volts, you may think that the 12 volt rail automatically can deliver more power to whatever component it's feeding. And while generally that's true, your 5 volt rail can run significantly higher amperage than the 12 volt rail, meaning that the 12 volt rail can be accessed when high potential energy differences are needed, and the 5 volt rail can be used to push electrons through your chip at a higher rate. They're both still pumping energy into the component, but they're specialized to deliver one form of energy to your system. It's funny because when your circuitry physically grows in size, let's say with an upgrade to your GPU, it may not necessarily need more voltage, but it will certainly require more current to keep the electrons moving. So when you buy a higher wattage power supply, you're really just increasing the amount of potential energy your system can pull for computations. Way outside my wheelhouse, but it's still a fascinating topic nonetheless. Moving back into SSDs, you can think of the IOPS as the current and the sequential bandwidth as the voltage. You can either brute force data throughput with higher bandwidth, or you can increase IOPS at the expense of bandwidth, giving your drive more responsiveness, which improves boot times and overall system usability. It also improves general efficiency, meaning that these drives can idle at lower wattages. However, under load, the NVMe drive sucks more power than the SATA equivalent. But this drive being under intense or constant load is pretty rare. Okay though, I know everyone's here to see what they'll need for gaming once the new consoles hit store shelves. And I'm gonna be completely honest, a hard drive for storing games is perfectly fine. My recommendation for storage, at least in 2020, is to run an SSD, usually a low capacity one, just for your OS and necessary software. Then just buy a 2TB hard drive to store your games on. Like I said earlier in this video, it's going to take a few years for developers to finally break free of the restrictions of current generation console hardware, which means that they'll be stuck with making their games compatible with slow SATA 2 HDDs. So in your gaming PC, a SATA 3 hard drive can already crush the consoles when it comes to load times, and for the next year or two, I don't think we're going to see the hard drive go extinct. It's just too cheap and mature of a manufacturing process to just abandon, when solid-state technology still has a long way to go until we reach mainstream, affordable high-capacity SSDs. But the implications of what we may see in a few years from now is kind of incredible. Reduced load times, more variance in scene geometry and detail, higher capacities, and taking the first steps into bringing these devices into your everyday computer. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. This video wasn't meant to put scorn onto hard drives, because frankly I still use them, and I'm perfectly content with them. I game, edit videos, and transfer data between systems, and not once have I ever found any issues with the hard drives hooked up in my system. But I'm curious as to what I'll be saying about this in a few years. It was fun talking, and if you want to learn more about computer hardware or software, then the annotations on screen are a great place to start. Thanks for spending your time with me, and thanks for watching.